The man never expected to hook a human head, but before he could even recover from the shock, several fishing hooks suddenly shot up from under the lake. When his friend returned and saw the scene before him, he was horrified, immediately rowing the boat over to save him. But little did he know that this was no accident at all, but rather a trap set by a female demon. By the time he finally managed with great difficulty to pull the other man onto the boat, the other guy only had half of his body left. Just as he was panicking, not knowing what to do, the head of a woman suddenly emerged from the surface of the lake on its own. Immediately after, a demonic hand directly flipped the entire boat over. Even more terrifying, the entire surface of the lake began to rapidly heat up, turning the freezing, bottomless lake into a giant, boiling pot of water in the blink of an eye. After that, the story begins with the female lead, Alice. Out of love, she married and moved from France to America, then opened a small restaurant with her husband, Will. However, their marriage not only failed to get better, but became increasingly fractured. Gradually, Will saw her as an unemployed person who only knew how to rely on him, increasingly suppressing Alice. This made Alice start to have thoughts of divorce. Finally, after another fierce argument, Alice absolutely could not take it anymore and suggested ending the marriage. Furious, Will immediately drove off. Initially, he just wanted to teach Alice a lesson, but Will never expected that this impulsive action would become the last time the two of them saw each other.
Now lead us to your family. We found you.
Will died in a car accident that caught everyone completely off guard. Just yesterday, he was still a living, breathing person appearing right in front of them, yet now he has become a corpse lying in a coffin. But what broke Alice's heart even more was that Will's parents, unable to accept the truth, blamed her for their son's death. They even regretted letting Will marry Alice, as if without this marriage, their son's accident would never have happened. It's just that no one knew that, from the very beginning, Will's death was never something that anyone could have prevented. But behind all of this, what terrifying secret is ultimately hiding? Finally, the funeral also came to an end. Her parents-in-law still couldn't escape their grief, so they suggested the whole family return to their ancestral home to live for a while. Conveniently to mourn Will, who had died so suddenly, Alice couldn't refuse, so she had to temporarily put her plans of returning to Paris on hold. But she never expected that her father-in-law, who still couldn't let go of Will, would become the biggest obstacle on her way back. Later, he secretly went to an employee at the crematorium hoping to see Will one last time, making the employee extremely conflicted. According to regulations, he shouldn't have agreed to this request, but looking at the haggard man who had lost his son, he ultimately didn't have the heart to say no and gave him 5 minutes to say his goodbyes to Will. Right as the tactful employee left, leaving private space for the father, an extremely faint knocking sound suddenly echoed from inside the coffin. The father couldn't believe his ears. He pressed his ear close to the coffin and, sure enough, heard a louder knock. The thought that his son might not be dead immediately took over his mind. Frantically, he pried open a large hole in the coffin, preparing to welcome the son he thought was lost, now seemingly back to life. But from the very moment he heard that knocking sound, he had already fallen into the demon's trap. The sound instantly attracted an employee who was patrolling the area. Yet, the demonic creature moved so fast that the employee only had time to let out a short scream before being torn to shreds, turning into pieces of flesh and vanishing in the office. That scene left the father paralyzed with panic. He was completely unaware that his right eye was emitting a bizarre light, staring blankly at the bloody scene before him as if hypnotized. The disaster had begun, but no one noticed his abnormality. To make matters worse, the suggestion to return to the old house this time also led the youngest son, Joseph, to discover something incredibly unusual, which was the Book of the Dead left behind by his grandfather. When this was discovered by his mother, she, who usually spoiled Joseph, was strict with him for the very first time. Not for any other reason, but because the things his grandfather left behind had long become a family taboo. It turned out that since his mother was young, his grandfather had been fascinated with things related to curses and demons. Outsiders all assumed it was just his hobby to kill time, because ghost stories are always vague and hard to believe. But the mother knew very well that it was his boundless exploration that had indirectly caused the grandmother to become mentally unstable. At the same time, it forced her mother from a young age to shoulder the responsibility of providing for the family, spending her whole life living for others. Therefore, she strictly forbade Joseph at all costs from following in his grandfather's disastrous footsteps. It's just that from the moment Joseph touched that dust-covered package, he had accidentally pushed the whole family into an even more terrifying abyss. Not long after, the father-in-law's abnormality gradually revealed itself. Upon hearing Joseph call, he ignored it and angrily took his frustration out on the machine. Joseph just thought that his father still couldn't accept the fact that his brother had passed away, so he decided to give him some private space to calm down. Little did he know, that very space created an opportunity for the demon to invade. After hearing strange noises, the father, half believing and half doubting, stepped down into the basement to check. In the end, the source of the sound was just a dead mouse caught in a mousetrap. He immediately realized he had been pranked, angrily intending to find the culprit behind the joke to settle the score. But in the next second, the lights suddenly flicked off. Trembling, he raised his dagger, but in the darkness, countless voices echoed from all directions. Ultimately, under the demon's seduction, the sharp knife in his hand instantly changed direction and became the weapon that decided his own life. That bloody and cruel scene was caught red-handed by Alice. She hastily snatched the knife from her father-in-law's hand, thanks to which she prevented another tragedy from happening to this pitiful family. This time, the father no longer had his previous overbearing attitude, but begged Alice to keep this a secret. Out of the goodness of her heart, Alice also decided to help him hide the incident. But in the end, that very kindness of Alice became the catalyst for the demon to become even more brazen. It was just that the people in the family were still drowning in the pain of losing Will, so they completely failed to realize the approaching danger. Even to memorialize Will, before their meal, the whole family gathered to rewatch a video, recording his and Alice's wedding. For everyone, this was nothing short of a nightmare from which they would never wake up. However, right at this moment, the demon once again silently took control of the father-in-law, making him reach for the knife on the dining table. Even though Alice noticed something was wrong and secretly took all the cutlery away, he later unconsciously grabbed another sharp object, while his mental state also became increasingly unhinged. "Will is dead. Why are you treating us like this, Dad?" "Dad, it's all your fault. You're the one who caused his death." The atmosphere at the dining table instantly became tense after this incident. Under the father-in-law's instigating words, Will's death was no longer something worthy of mourning, but became a burden that made everyone look for ways to blame each other. Whoever felt a guilty conscience was the one who had murdered his son. "He is down there." That sentence left Alice frozen in shock. By the time everyone regained their senses, not only had the pet dog died tragically at the hands of the father-in-law, but he himself was once again severely injured by a sharp object. Joseph and his girlfriend, Thuya, frantically rushed his father to the hospital. However, on the way, a strange thing happened. The father's wounds suddenly healed in an inexplicable way. Both of them couldn't believe the sight before their eyes. Right after that, to Joseph's horror, his father snatched the sharp weapon and maniacally stabbed towards Thea's neck. Realizing the situation was going south, Joseph tried his best to tie his father to the car seat, but that ferocious strength seemed absolutely not human at all. Yet, immediately after, the father kicked forcefully against the dashboard, bursting the bindings, and once again reached his claw-like hand towards Thea. But that still wasn't enough. The bright red blood seemed to have awakened his bloodlust. Not only did he use Joseph as a tool to open the sunroof, he also put Thea in a situation hanging by a thread. As the headrest was about to impale his girlfriend, Joseph, a coward by nature, chose to abandon her to save himself by climbing out through the sunroof to escape. Right after, everything in the world seemed to stop in that moment. Terrified, Joseph turned his head back to look, only to see his once gentle father now emitting a bizarre light from his eyes, a horrific disaster about to erupt. At the same time, the mother-in-law also went with Alice to the mountains to bury the poor dog that had died tragically. However, when Alice brought the tools back to the shed, she accidentally discovered the grandfather's diary that her mother-in-law was planning to throw away. The diary recorded the events that occurred in October 1983 regarding that damn Book of the Dead. He had warned everyone not to read the taboo curses inside it. The documents noted that simply reading aloud 4 words written on the page could unleash an evil power. The grandfather had warned many people, but no one would listen. In the end, they all died gruesomely and became puppets of the demon. Later on, that evil power also targeted him. To protect his wife and children, he frantically searched for ways to break the curse and finally found a dagger forged by a council of sages. Just a light slash with it could separate the demon's soul from the possessed person's body. This was an incredibly precious holy relic. Ultimately, the grandfather decided to hide it to avoid being discovered by the demon. The series of seemingly absurd notes left Alice thoroughly confused. Out of curiosity, she picked up the scattered pages and began reading the 4 mysterious words. Kunda Estrada. Every time Alice read a word aloud, the evil power thousands of kilometers away took one step closer to her. Perhaps sensing something unsettling, Alice ultimately didn't read the 4th word. Unfortunately, just 3 words were already enough to trigger the demon's curse. Looking at the pet dog in front of her, now no different from a walking corpse, Alice tried to suppress her fear and was forced to finish it off once again. This reminded her of the notes in the grandfather's book. Alice rushed back to the house to tell her mother-in-law everything. But because she was so terrified, she couldn't speak a word. Right at that moment, Joseph also came running home trembling after his escape, telling his mother that Thea had been harmed. Before anyone could even recover, a horrifying knock on the door echoed from behind them. "Open the door, it's me." After a moment of hesitation, Alice finally stepped forward to open it, but the scene before her far exceeded everyone's expectations. All 3 of them froze in shock at the horrifying wounds on Thaya's body. Yet Thaya seemed to feel absolutely no pain. She gently pulled out the metal rod piercing her head and even drank the burning candle along with the hot wax as if it were a fine wine. The demon had taken complete control of her body. In the very next second, she suddenly lunged hard at the mother-in-law. Joseph and Alice had to use all their strength to barely lock her in the basement. The 4 of them hurriedly fled the old house, but just as they stepped outside, they ran into the demon-possessed father-in-law. Beside him was the pet dog, resurrected yet again. Everyone was stunned silent by the horrific sight, but soon after, the father pulled out the weapon Joseph had left behind and pointed it straight at them. A bone-chilling cold instantly spread through everyone's bodies. Even more terrifying, under the demon's control, the father turned the gun barrel towards himself and pulled the trigger. If it were a normal person, he would have certainly collapsed on the spot. But he was just like a soulless puppet, the corners of his mouth even curling into a terrifying smile. The 4 of them panicked and ran back into the old house, then used all the heavy objects inside to barricade every door that could be opened. They thought they would be absolutely safe this way, but forgot that Thea was still locked in the basement. "Please open the door." The grandmother, suffering from senile dementia, completely off her guard, directly pulled the door latch. Realizing the plan had succeeded, the father standing outside also let out a sinister smile. Not a single person could escape from their grasp. The 3 of them rushed to the living room. On the clean floor, the sharp-eyed Alice spotted a few thick drops of blood. The 2 of them carefully peeked their heads out to check. And the thing that appeared before their eyes was Thaya, completely possessed by the demon. To protect his family, Joseph could only grit his teeth and grab the desk lamp and a weapon. But right as he looked up, Thaya had vanished. He immediately turned to look at Alice, and she too was in extreme panic. Alice fearfully took step by step forward, completely unaware that Thaya was still secretly watching them. A horrifying scream rang out. In the critical moment, Joseph once again stood frozen in place. The mother-in-law didn't care about Alice's life or death either, only focused on pulling her son back to safety. But unfortunately, Thaya wouldn't let her continue coddling this cowardly son. Empowered by the demon, she unleashed all her resentment from being abandoned by her boyfriend, along with her hatred, onto the mother and son. But that still wasn't the demon's ultimate goal. The thing it wanted from the very beginning to the very end was that ancient dagger. As Thea continued to close in step by step, the cowardly Joseph could only continuously back away. But he didn't know that right behind him were multiple knives with their handles pointing straight up. A heart-piercing pain made Joseph break out in a cold sweat. Sensing the sudden pressure pinning him down, he instinctively grabbed a wine opener and stabbed it through Thea's neck. But this strike couldn't hurt her in the slightest. Soon after, Thea found the grandmother walking alone and forced her to reveal the location of the ancient dagger. But how could a person suffering from senile dementia clearly remember such things? The next second, Thea took the grandmother's dentures and shoved them into her own mouth, chewing as if enjoying a delicious meal, then returned it to its owner. This thing would cure her. However, just as Thea was about to take the grandmother's prosthetic leg as well, she discovered it was gone. Just as Thea was about to stand up to take revenge, a heavy object suddenly smashed continuously straight into her face. It turned out to be Joseph, who had just escaped. Looking at his girlfriend possessed by the demon, the naturally timid Joseph completely lost control. He grabbed a heavy object and maniacally smashed Thea dozens of times. Not until her skull was nearly crushed did he terrifyingly snap back to his senses. Alice immediately asked Joseph, what exactly did the demon want? Or was their family hiding some other secret? Joseph explained that in the past, their grandfather always believed a demon had appeared in this place, so to fight it, he traveled the world seeking all kinds of documents. Now, those books were stored in the attic, and that was also the only way the two of them could escape the demon. But before Joseph and Alice could act, something happened to the grandmother upstairs. "Good night, Mom." "Good night, Susan." Susan was the mother-in-law's real name, but ever since her mother got senile dementia, she had never called her daughter by that name again. It's just that, the person standing before her, was it really her mother? Clearly, the problem lay in the dentures that Thea had once touched. However, faced with the sight of her presumed lost mother appearing again, Susan was so overjoyed that she lost all reason due to familial love. She immediately rushed into her mother's arms, then, under the old woman's guidance, moved towards the window. It's just that this time, upon seeing her husband with his body covered in blood and flesh, she felt no fear at all. Danger was imminent, but Alice downstairs remained completely oblivious. She naively thought that her father-in-law had voluntarily left, never expecting that the next second a voice would ring out. "He's no longer here, perhaps we." The sound immediately attracted the mother-in-law's attention upstairs. Under the manipulation of her mother and husband, she was now completely on the demon's side. To her, nothing mattered more than the whole family being reunited. In the darkness, the father-in-law appeared once again, reeking of blood all over, and violently slammed Alice onto the table. He warned her not to interfere with his family's affairs. But seeing that scene, the mother-in-law only cared about the injured Joseph and scolded her husband for deceiving her. Yet she didn't know that the man in front of her was no longer the husband she once knew. After dealing with those standing in his way, the father-in-law directly dragged his severely injured youngest son over, forcing him to lie on Thea's corpse. Blood and bone fragments splattered all over Joseph's face. He originally thought this sight would force the timid son into submission, but after everything he had been through, Joseph was no longer the weakling he used to be. The noise of the fierce struggle woke up the unconscious Alice. She tried her best to curl up and crawl towards the attic, finally managing to close the door right before the demon spotted her. Unfortunately, Joseph, who had been caught, was not so lucky. Joseph tried to hold on to his last breath to remind Alice that she absolutely must find the dagger before the demon found it. By this time, the entire house had turned into a pile of rubble under the demon's massacre, and only Alice was the lone survivor trying to hold on. Remembering Joseph's instructions, Alice found a handy weapon and carefully stepped into the attic. But despite her high alert, the demon still found her. However, Alice now was no longer the Alice of before. Facing the grandmother's frenzied attacks, she used all her strength to grab a picture frame and smash it hard against her head, but still couldn't withstand the terrifying power of someone possessed by a demon. The grandmother interrogated Alice, asking if she knew the dagger's location. Alice gritted her teeth and didn't answer. The very next second, a steel pen pierced straight through her right ear. Not only that, the possessed grandmother even instigated the mother-in-law to activate the switch of the gear system. If successful, Alice's head would be split in half. This forced Alice to risk her life to find a way to save herself. Taking advantage of a loophole, Alice hastily tied the grandmother to the wheelchair, then activated the staircase lift, finally lucky enough to keep her life. But the danger wasn't over yet. Alice couldn't believe things had gotten to this point. Trembling, she pulled the steel pen out, but realized a broken piece was still lodged in her ear. Angrily, she stood up, glaring at the grandmother. Before she could strike, an unidentified heavy object fell from above, crashing hard onto the floor. Alice hurriedly picked up her weapon, intending to flee, but ultimately couldn't bear to leave her mother-in-law behind. Even though she hated her, Joseph had saved her life after all. Alice considered this as returning the favor. However, just to be safe, she still tied her mother-in-law next to the toilet. Then, she exerted her strength once more to finally pull out the remaining piece of the steel pen lodged in her ear. But seeing that scene, not only did the mother-in-law feel no guilt, she instead became even more convinced that it was Alice, this jinx of a woman, who had brought disaster upon their entire family. Anyone looking in could tell that this entire family had gone insane. But with things having reached this point, Alice was no longer stubbornly trying to make the other person understand her. In her eyes, nothing was more important than surviving and escaping this place. But fate once again played a cruel joke on Alice. Soon after, the sounds of bones dislocating echoed consecutively, sending chills down one's spine, and the mother-in-law also became completely a puppet of the demon. She used a plastic sheet to chain Alice's head, then crawled onto the ceiling in a completely inhuman posture, hanging her high up. As Alice was about to suffocate, in a critical moment, she hastily grabbed a vegetable peeler and pointed it straight at her mother-in-law's face. In pain, she finally let go. Alice immediately seized the only chance to fight back, once again wielding the chainsaw and thrusting it hard into her mother-in-law. Seeing the other completely lose strength, she crawled and dragged herself to the attic, rummaging through everything but still finding no clues. Right at that moment, Joseph's familiar voice suddenly rang out from downstairs. When the majority of the demon's body had crawled up to the attic, Alice had no choice but to grab each dagger and stab them continuously into Joseph's body. Yet, despite the countless sounds of tearing flesh, the demon remained completely unscathed inside Joseph's body, making it even more aggressive and arrogant. Initially, Alice thought the dagger was just a legend left behind by the grandfather. It wasn't until the next knife pierced into Joseph's body that the demon, who was just mocking Alice, was instantly ripped right out of his body. Clearly, the knife in Alice's hand was the ultimate weapon, capable of destroying the demon. But before she could even celebrate, a bizarre crawling sound echoed from below. Realizing the danger, Alice hastily opened the skylight, then slid down the roof. Luckily, she managed to stop herself, but the dagger accidentally slipped from her hand and fell into the snow. Fortunately, the chainsaw she used for self-defense was still in her hand. But before she could even prepare, the mother-in-law crawled onto the roof in an incredibly grotesque posture, stepping closer to Alice, who was stuck in the chimney. Ultimately, the mother-in-law was taken down. But right after, the father-in-law heard the commotion and lunged at Alice. However, he still couldn't withstand the power of the chainsaw and was instantly decapitated. This created an opportunity for Alice. That fire not only completely severed the ties between Alice and Will's family, but also marked the beginning of a brand new Alice. After being reborn, she picked up the dagger and stabbed it straight into the pet dog's body. Finally, everything came to an end. Alice lay on the ground, panting heavily after escaping the disaster. But unexpectedly, that demonic voice rang out from above again. "Look at you now. You still can't leave this place." Clearly, no one expected that as long as they weren't stabbed by the Kandarian dagger, even if their bodies were burned to a crisp, they still couldn't escape the demon's control. "Where you once promised that even death couldn't part us, I will keep my promise." Alice, this borderline insane love, is the reason. From the very beginning, Alice wanted to end the marriage, but she never expected that, in the end, it would become the curse that took her own life. As Alice was preparing to use the dagger for a final showdown with the demon, in the blink of an eye, that charred figure suddenly vanished. Alice carefully observed her surroundings, but was still caught off guard by the demon and knocked into the abyss. Hearing the demon's arrogant words, in order not to die here, Alice could only grit her teeth and endure the pain, trying to lift her foot, which was pierced by an iron bar. However, right at the moment she was about to escape, she was grabbed by the demon. In the decisive moment, Alice once again wielded her weapon and stabbed straight into the demon's heart. But just like what she had discovered earlier, if not stabbed by the dagger, the demon's soul could never be banished. Fortunately, Alice had prepared a plan early on. When her arm returned to its position on the ground, the sharp dagger finally struck the demon. Everything had finally come to an end. After that, Alice took the dagger, used her last bit of strength to crawl out to the main road, and was discovered by firefighters, ready to start a completely new life.
Christopher and Leroy. Explore.
Mommy's back.
Today's story ends here. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.